Namaste and welcome to Urban.chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I'm joined by Harsh Gupta, author, economist, investor, and an eternal optimist in the story of India. Harsh, welcome to the show.
Namaste, Abhinav. Thank you so much for having me again on your show. I hope you're doing good.
All good, Harsh. Hope same is the case with you.
Thank you.
So, Harsh, today we want to discuss about the economic performance of the Yogi Sarkar in Uttar Pradesh and what more can be done to make sure that Uttar Pradesh reaches its full potential when it comes to economy, especially manufacturing. So let me start by asking a very simple question. How do you rate the performance of the BJP government under the leadership of Chief Minister Yogi and also the double engine ki Sarkar, the Prime Minister Modi, how it has done over the last 5 years?
Abhinav, I must say that obviously we all have our conscious and subconscious biases, but even trying to keep that aside, I think an excellent job has been done by the Yogi Adityanath government at the state level. And you're right, absolutely supplemented and supported by the union government headed by Prime Minister Modi. And this is not something that I'm saying now, because if you've read some of my old columns in Mint or Swarajya, I have been talking about the great North Indian plains for a long time and how that is extremely important for the India story to develop. So we'll come to it, but Uttar Pradesh obviously is at the heart of it. So seeing a lot of work on development, infrastructure and law and order is extremely, extremely gratifying for somebody who follows the India economic story very closely.
But let's say, what are the key achievements of the government over the last 5 years, especially the state government, and then also when we look at the center and the government together?
See, I think before I answer it, I'll let you know what exactly do we need for a state, a country, or a region to develop, right? Especially one that is relatively backward to begin with. What you need is investment. You need a lot of investment. You need a lot of private sector investment in terms of factories as well as the services, jobs, and offices. And you need the facilitating wherewithal by the government in the form of hard physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. So if you break it into that, because that is where the money comes in, that is where the jobs come in, and that is where the people stop emigrating to other parts of India, outside of India, on the margin. That is basically development, when you can actually get a productive job according to your skills, relatively close to your house. You have the option to go outside, but you have that option to stay where you are. So in that sense, there are three components I would talk about. One is law and order, and related to that, rule of law. Second is physical infrastructure, which is very important for manufacturing, as you were saying in the beginning, and the logistics thereof. And the third is social infrastructure, which includes education, obviously right now health, but also then on the more kind of digital public goods that you and I have spoken about earlier, and how that kind of technology is transforming the state, the country, and the world economy overall. So I think on law and order, again, if we start there, there are critics, there are partisan and other critics who obviously have a particular view about what happened during the anti-CAA riots. But I think more broadly, if you ask the average person, or if you ask the average investor sitting in Mumbai, sitting in any other big metropolis, for that matter, even New Delhi, earlier they would scoff at Uttar Pradesh, saying that, we might have a factory in Gurgaon. If you want to go, we'll go to the suburbs of Gurgaon in Haryana. Manesar we'll go to. But Uttar Pradesh, we are not so sure, because there's a lot of Gunda Raj there. Now, some of this is reality. Some of this is obviously perception. And how much of that is reality is also difficult to say, because if the state administration is not registering cases of a certain kind, let's say under previous administrations, it does not even show in official data, because that's all we have to go by to compare in a quantitative manner. So what is most important right now is that perception of capital has changed in terms of Uttar Pradesh being a safe, literally a physically safe place to put in your money and therefore do long-term investments. Because any factory is a long-term gestation project, right? You are going to make it and hopefully use it for 10, 20, 15 years or longer. There is a depreciation. So if you don't believe that this place is something where you can, because once your asset is there, a lot of people can come to extort you. So I think on that count, the perception of safety from industrialists to maybe women walking on the ground, I think that perception has definitely increased. Now, secondly, on physical infrastructure, we'll come into details later, but broadly, what is physical infrastructure? One aspect is roads. There is a complete expressway revolution. Very soon, Uttar Pradesh will have more expressways than the rest of the country combined. And it is for a moment, let us take a step back and imagine how audacious a statement that is, because obviously the first proper expressway that was built in India was the Mumbai-Pune expressway. A relatively short expressway, say of 200 kilometers. Or what is an expressway? An expressway is a highway, but where there is no signals. So, it's basically what is known as access controlled roads, and it's bi-directional, multiple lanes. So basically you often don't have two-wheelers, you don't have cows and dogs, you don't have people with bullock carts. Those are important, and you have separate roads for that, but you have fast throughput in expressways. So the lorries and trucks and private cars can go very quickly, and they pay a toll for that. But if you don't even have an option of paying a toll, there is no question. So those expressways are being built across the state, and we'll come into some length on that. On the rail side, there's a dedicated freight corridor, the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor, a part of which has been already inaugurated from roughly the NCR region to Kanpur, 351 kilometers. The rest is on the way by December 2022 or next year. And then, of course, it connects to the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor around NCR, and therefore you can access both the West Coast and East Coast. And of course, we also have a lot of investments in power, but that is relatively less of an issue than it was 10 years ago. On the soft infrastructure, I think you know very well the kind of Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath had started his tenure with this Japanese encephalitis cases being like a massive problem for him, even though it was inherited, those government hospital malpractices and deaths, but they have dramatically reduced. During the COVID pandemic, again, the UP deaths, people disagree on the number of deaths, that's fine. Those debates will continue until we get a final number by next year. And it is true that even if there is less obesity and less old people, that state is anyway safer. But even adjusting for all that, UP has had a much better record than what people were anticipating 1 or 2 years ago. If you go and read the columns, people were saying that Uttar Pradesh is going to become a killing field. Right. And except some really worrying photos that we had in the Ganga, which were obviously blown up, we've not really had any kind of evidence of that so far. Of course, once the numbers are tallied in terms of the missing people, we'll get to know more details later on. And finally, on the social infrastructure, I think it's very important to understand as this pandemic has happened, this work from home thing is happening. A lot of people from Bangalore, Mumbai, and NCR obviously have gone back to their towns in Uttar Pradesh. They are working from there. Some of them will return. Some of them will not return. Some of them will continue to working where they are because either they are also parents of young children, or they have old parents in turn they have to take care of, or just because the cost of living is cheap and they just want to go to their main office, say once a month. And that also, by the way, they can now, if they're in Uttar Pradesh and go to NCR, they can take an excellent expressway and go within 3-4 hours. So that social public digital goods in terms of transferring money has become so easy, right? Earlier, you had to go to a bank and fill out a statement, give some goose. Now it's just click in 1 second, the UPI, the money goes. If you want to order something for your mother or father in an emergency situation, there is Swiggy and Zomato. There are e-commerce that all deliver almost every potential postal code. So I think that massive transformation in which the government has a major role, but even the private sector in terms of technology, across first and foremost law and order, which of course is fully the government, infrastructure, which is government, but also PPP mode, and finally social infrastructure, which is government, but also private companies, has completely changed how an average person who's thinking in terms of jobs or investments is looking at UP now in 2022, say compared to 2012, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And I think that obviously will take some time to show results because these are massive economies, massive ships that take time to reorient. But I think the marginal job and the marginal investment dollar or rupee has now started to go towards UP. And I think that is the most encouraging sign because, as I was saying, this entire North Indian plains, which is so dense, Eastern UP and Bihar are approaching 2,000 people per square kilometer of density, which is, as I often say, more dense than greater New York City area, right? So this is much bigger. So Uttar Pradesh right now is probably 230 million population. It was around 199 million in the official 2011 census. Maybe Bihar is now tied with Maharashtra at around 125 million or so. And Bihar is about 100,000 kilometers or slightly less, and UP is 200,000 kilometers or slightly more. Especially eastern UP and parts of northern UP, which is the Nepal border, Bharej, Pilibhit, from Rampur, that region has historically been, still is relatively the most underdeveloped part of Uttar Pradesh, along with parts of eastern UP. So ab udhar wo Ganga Express, we'll discuss in detail, but now that this infrastructure is coming, I expect the future to be different, provided that the focus on infrastructure and law and order remains.
Yeah, that's true. And this is something which I also hear from east to the west to the UP. Everyone, even someone who is not the voter of the BJP, says that law and order is much, much, much better than before. They feel much safer living in their villages or going out in the night in the countryside than they were under the previous government. But let's continue the discussion about the infrastructure itself, the physical infrastructure being built by the Yogi government with the help of the center. Of course, expressways are under the center as such. So, and you also mentioned this Terai belt of Uttar Pradesh, northern UP, which is extremely backward. People don't realize it's very backward, one of the most backward regions in the world.
Yes.
Right? All this Balrampur, Gonda, Siddharth Nagar, Bahraich. What can be done about it, and what future do you see for these reasons?
So absolutely. So I think the first and foremost thing is, again, physical infrastructure. Nitin Gadkari has, I think, motto in his office, I think quoting JFK, that, America does not have great roads because it is rich. America is rich because it has great roads. And it's important to understand the causality to some extent there. See, historically, what happened was, in Indian civilization actually moved from what is Punjab, Haryana to what is now UP, Bihar. If you look right from Indus Valley civilization times to maybe post-Rig-Vedic times, like post-Vedic times. And the reason was this area was cut down. It's one of the most fertile soils of the world because of the alluvial deposits of the Himalayas. And in fact, India has more arable land than America or China, despite being 1/3 the size. America and China individually, not collectively. And a lot of it is in the Great Northern Plains. Now, historically, we would build something and transfer that through the rivers, which is why our great spiritual cities, our religious cities, are also happen to be commercial cities, like, for example, Kashi. And all of them were on rivers, because you would transport something down the Ganga, it would go to Bengal or Odisha, and you could, for example, if you had to transport it either to Rome or to Southeast Asia, it could be done from there. Now, as population increased during pre-British and British times, and after that, a lot of the water flow was taken out because canals were dug out for irrigation purposes. And for transportation purposes, they were not navigable anymore for all practical purposes, these rivers. You have to do a lot of regular dredging and stuff, which was basically neglected. So this area, which has so much human population, human capital, incipient potential human capital, Bihar, just south of Bihar, what used to be part of Bihar, there is Jharkhand, rich in mineral deposits, and right next to eastern Uttar Pradesh. So you had everything that you needed, but you did not have the physical infrastructure anymore. So because now, therefore, what happens is, even today, a lot of, for example, textile units are in the southern part of India or the western part of India, because they are coastal states, they have good logistics, they have focused on infrastructure, despite the cost of labor being high there compared to, say, Uttar Pradesh. So even though there is an obvious arbitrage, you can't fill that arbitrage without the physical infrastructure. So what have we done on the physical infrastructure? Let's discuss that for a moment, and then we'll come to that belt that we discussed. I think physical infrastructure, you have the Ganga Expressway being built, right, which goes from above Meerut to, it basically crosses right across Ganga down to the southeast of Uttar Pradesh. Purvanchal Expressway was just launched. Earlier, we already had the Noida-Agra, and then, which is Yamuna Expressway, and then the Agra-Lucknow Expressway. And then, of course, the Bundelkhand Expressway is being built. And there are many link roads that are being built, one to Gorakhpur and so on and so forth. And Nitin Gadkari ji, the Chief Minister and the Prime Minister, they have announced that from Gorakhpur to Shamli westwards, and then Gorakhpur to Siliguri, new expressways are now under consideration in a DPR phase sense. And of course, they'll further connect from Balia to Patna, and Patna to Kolkata has been announced. So the idea is you go from NCR, Delhi and beyond to Haryana, Punjab, from Calcutta. What Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji built as a highway, you will now have an expressway network along it, along with a dedicated freight corridor for rail. Because if they take away freight, then you have much more scope left for passenger rail in terms of speed as well as cost. And therefore, even more space left on the new expressways for more people to travel. So the basic idea is you build roads and therefore markets come connected. You can have factories there, which you could not have earlier. Therefore, you have jobs, and then you have services around those jobs, direct and indirect jobs. So these expressways and railroads, metros, many airports have opened, including now the 5th international airport is being opened up. Now, that particular belt, historically, people have thought of UP as being more underdeveloped in eastern compared to western parts. And that is true. But what you have rightly mentioned is a lot of people have forgotten that the northern area, Terai region or touching Nepal, north of Lucknow, that thin belt, is also quite populated and is actually in many ways even more underdeveloped. So having discussed the expressways part, let's now go to that region that we discussed, which is the northern part, sometimes neglected. We focus too much on the east versus west dynamics of Uttar Pradesh. And I think there, of course, infrastructure is a big part, but there is also a geopolitical and a geoeconomic angle to it, which is where the union government will also come into play. I think our commerce with Nepal has to deepen. I think for that region also to develop further. I think historically our relationship with Nepal has been social, cultural, civilizational, and quite frankly, based on a lot of Nepali people working in India. But in terms of physical goods being traded across the Indo-Nepali border, there has not been much. And I think if Uttar Pradesh expressways develop and the connection with Bihar and Calcutta and therefore Haldia port further extends, that will allow this region to develop. Because ultimately Nepal is a landlocked country. And because currently northern UP and obviously Nepal itself is underdeveloped, China is trying to fish in those waters. But I think as Uttar Pradesh develops and as trade with Nepal increases, that belt will benefit a lot. But there are backward district programs by the union government where if you actually go through the list, you will see many of these districts being on the top, Bharej and so on and so forth. So I think there is really no shortcut except focusing on the physical capital and human capital. But the additional point being trade with Nepal in the coming decade.
Exactly. But when we talk about, we have talked about physical infrastructure a lot. But let's say, what about the medical facilities in Uttar Pradesh and also the schools in Uttar Pradesh? Many people don't know that Sarkari schools in UP have got a drastic transformation. Much more is still required to be done. But when I was traveling in UP, Harsh, this is something which almost everyone said. Schools are in much, much better condition, Sarkari schools in the villages than before. So how do you rate the performance of the government on the health and the education?
So let's do health first and then education. I think health, we already spoke that there was the tenure of this chief minister, Shri Yogi Adityanath, started off with a very bad case of Japanese encephalitis being spreading and many children lost their lives. Then, of course, a lot of drastic action was taken. That seems to have been controlled. Of course, the pandemic happened. A recent Niti Aayog report came out ranking states. And what was found that actually amongst the large states, Uttar Pradesh was ranked the last. However, in terms of improvement, it was ranked first. So it is an interesting way to look at it. Obviously, people with a particular agenda will focus on the fact that it came last. And quite frankly, to me also it is surprising that it ranked even below Bihar. But the improvement was by far the largest in Uttar Pradesh. So if we want to judge a government, I think this episode is more on the economics, less on the politics. But if we want to judge a government, we obviously have to focus on the change or the delta and not the absolute. It's not like 5 years ago, Uttar Pradesh had the country's best health system, right? Obviously not. So I think that's what the Niti Aayog report says. And if the Niti Aayog report, which is under the union government, which is a BJP government, and if we trust the data, it shows a very clearly mixed picture of low starting point, but rapid improvements. Now, on the education aspect, it is very encouraging, the kind of anecdotal data that you are relaying to me and the viewers. Because you see, what happened is, if you look at Pratham, the NGO, which releases every year ASER, Annual Survey of Education report, which focuses on rural India. And if you look at other reports, other journalistic stories as well, there has been long-term trend of the poorest in Indian villages, the relatively, and of course across villages, but including the poorest, shifting from government schools, Sarkari schools, to budget private schools, whether they are registered or not. However, in the pandemic, because of obvious economic difficulties, we had a situation whereby the enrollment in government schools, Sarkari schools, actually increased. Just like, for example, MG and RAGA requirements, which as a percentage of GDP was either flatlining or quite frankly falling, during this stressful time, it increased, along with obviously food subsidies that the union governments kind of made sure almost everybody in the country got as a basic safety net. One of the things that used to happen before Yogi Adityanath came to power, although it was tried to be reversed by Shri Rajnath Singh when he was Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh in the 90s, there was widespread cheating in these matric exams, 10th, 12th board exams, because there was a sense of entitlement ki if this is our government, obviously our kids have to pass. Right. And the idea was not that children should learn something. The idea was if children do not pass, how will they go to college? If they do not go to college, how will I get them married? Right. It was more like a certificate or a stamp कि बच्चा 12वीं कर लिया, अभी कॉलेज है, अब शादी की बात कर सकते हैं. So one of the earliest things that the Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath did in terms of education, schooling and examinations, this proctoring, was he said that no more cheating. Now, I'm not saying that cheating is completely stopped in Uttar Pradesh or for that matter, the rest of the country or the whole world. I'm sure there are cases. But what was almost a deliberate, unwritten government policy has been changed. And therefore, along with the broad changes in RTE, which have been done, for example, there was an automatic promotion idea, which has now been quietly sidestepped under the right to education. So there is a certain kind of rigor which has come back. And government schools have gotten better because they've gotten more money, more investments. Although the teacher unions have been opposing full cameras or what is known as, these kind of thumb access attendance recording instruments, some of them have been opposing that because some teachers actually get the job and then they send a substitute to teach sometimes. But on the whole, there is a big improvement. And again, it comes down to political will, because these things could have been done earlier also. So whether it is health or education, there is a clear improvement. But of course, we have to be cognizant of the fact that from a low base that precedes any of this government or political party.
So Harsh, two final questions, and these are more of more conceptual questions. See, economic growth is not just about setting up a factory or building a road or something.
No.
It has to be accompanied by social transformation. Political systems also play a role in the economic development. Of course, they are all interrelated. One drives the other. So if economy is transforming, of course, the society will change, other things will change. Do you think that the social changes or the social structures and the political structures in Uttar Pradesh impose a high ceiling on the economic growth rate which can be achieved? Because remember, even technology is not independent of the wider socioeconomic context.
No, absolutely you're right. In fact, I was just reading yesterday, our common friend Vikram Sampath's book on Veer Savarkar. And he had written actually in favor of technology, saying technology is agnostic in a moral sense. It comes down to human and social structures, whether it is used for good purposes, bad purposes, or not used at all. So I think what is happening in Uttar Pradesh, and of course, Uttar Pradesh is emblematic of larger forces and dynamics within India, is that definitely a big social churn is happening. And it goes along with economic growth. I think the exposure that the young have today in terms of what exists outside has dramatically changed. Because let us not forget that the cheap data revolution has already changed society to some extent. Because if you imagine 10 years ago, and I've actually worked in villages for almost a year, in 2009 and 10, it used to be really boring in villages in evenings and nights.
No,
There
no.
was really
When were you working in the villages and
Eastern
where and why?
Rajasthan, Eastern Rajasthan, second half of 2009 and first half of 2010, approximately that time. It used to be really, really boring in villages because either you did not have internet, most people didn't have a smartphone, and even if you got internet, it was very slow, like 2G or something. I did use it occasionally for Google Maps, but very, very slowly. So there was really nothing to do. But now suddenly everybody has access to the entire world's education, information, and entertainment at their doorsteps, at their fingertips. And they are seeing how people are living in the cities. They are seeing how people are living outside of India. And they are imagining things that they could not have imagined earlier, right? In terms of what profession they will choose and what direction they will take in their personal lives. That, along with economic mobility and economic growth and education, especially female education. And one very interesting thing I've noticed is that Uttar Pradesh's GER, gross enrollment ratio for higher education, which is the 18 to 23 demographic percentage of that which is enrolled in some kind of higher education, is actually higher than many states which are richer on a per capita income. It's very strange. Like in many ways, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, especially Andhra Pradesh, is developed but relatively low on some educational numbers. So maybe socially it's more of an unequal state in some ways. Perhaps it's just my initial hypothesis. I could be wrong. But Uttar Pradesh, if you look at educational numbers as opposed to per capita income numbers, if you do an XY axis, it scores higher on the education part. So that shows that if you are looking at the future and not just the present Uttar Pradesh per capita income might be 85, 90,000 rupees, whereas India average may be 1,50,000, 1,60,000. Haryana might have gone up to 4 lakh rupees, 3 lakh, 4 lakh rupees. And of course, some cities, Goa, Delhi, Pondicherry might be 5 lakhs. It might be slightly more than half of Indian per capita income, but in terms of human capital flow, not stock, that is the new cohorts, the new young age people who are coming up, who will be the key working age population 10, 20, 30 years from now, Uttar Pradesh is much closer to the national average and in some cases also above the national average. Obviously not in health, but in some educational numbers, it is, or close to the national average. So in that sense, a social churn is happening. I think you will obviously know the caste dynamics and the political equations much better than me. But there is no doubt that there is a greater sense of dispersion of power. In fact, the chief minister recently said that whichever Gunda is there, of whichever Bahubali is there, of whatever religion and whatever caste, he will not be spared. And I think you and I know that actually that has broadly happened on the ground. And in fact, it has caused a lot of resentment in some quarters, including some Hindu quarters also. So there is a clear sense of diffusion of power. Of course, much more remains to be done. Uttar Pradesh's official urbanization numbers as per the 2011 census was only 22%. I think amongst the large state, only Bihar, Assam and Odisha were lower. But what has happened is because of the high population density and all these amenities coming in, cooking gas, sanitation, electricity, pakka roads, that effectively the large villages have now become small towns. And India's urbanization numbers are anyways slightly misleading. They underestimate the actual urbanization because other countries have looser definitions. We have, it must be 5,000 population, X percentage of people must never do agriculture, males must do this, females must. So we have a very archaic definition of urbanization in our census numbers. Actual urbanization by international comparable standards is actually higher. And what will happen for Uttar Pradesh and Bihar is they will suddenly go from one of the least urbanized states in India to some of the most like Kerala or parts of Tamil Nadu because the population density is already there. You just put the basic amenities of urban infrastructure and those large villages convert into small towns. So I think once that happens, education, urbanization, economic growth and industrialization, I think the social dynamic is very clear. Now, whether it actually plays out in real time in politics or not, I think that is something you can answer better than I can.
We'll wait and see, Harsh. And now there's a restriction on me where I can't speak many things like before. But my last question to you, we know that the economy grows when there is more freedom to the people, markets and these systems can work more autonomously. But in the case of UP and also in the case of India, what we have is a very weak state, and we always needed a strong state. So one of the achievements of the government has been to impose some semblance of administration, rule of law, and the law and order. But do you think that has also led to certain kind of bureaucratic raj in a country like India, and especially in UP, which is counterproductive to the economic growth rate, which that we want to achieve in the coming decade? So how do we balance the weaker administration, weaker law and order, and then suddenly a total bureaucratic raj?
No, I think it's an excellent question. In fact, it applies to but also applies to India at large, which is you need a strong state, but you need a constrained state, right? And what we actually had in India was the opposite. We had a weak state, but an all-encompassing state. So we actually had the worst of both worlds, and we need to move towards the best of both worlds. So let me explain very briefly and quickly. You need law and order first and foremost, right? Because if you have enough police numbers per capita in India, we do not. You have enough lower judiciary numbers per capita in India, we do not. Of course, if you use technology, the number of cases, litigation will decrease. That is true. And more importantly, you need many more higher bureaucrats. Let me say it very clearly. India actually does not have enough bureaucrats if you focus on the upper echelons of bureaucracy. But if you focus on the lower side, if you count the person who is getting chai, or who is, say, effectively somebody who is manning the gates or is an assistant kind of levels, grade D officers, that, of course, very important. And whoever are working there, we have full respect for them. But going forward, many of those jobs could be automated. But you need many more people at the higher level, at the state level, at the union government level. For example, I've been talking to people in the diplomatic service, foreign service, or trade negotiation services. And they say things like, we go for trade negotiations and we basically do some research, some internal documents, some videos, some Wikipedia, and the Chinese or Japanese or South Korean negotiator, his assistant sitting behind him, knows all our details by heart. It's not because he is much sharper per se. In some cases, they might be more hardworking. Our bureaucrats can also be very hardworking. There's simply more of them at the right educational level. So state capacity is very, very important in India, where we have to invest more in our law and order, and as well as public health and education and upper echelons of bureaucracy. So right now, when I used to work in Eastern Rajasthan, the DM, which was also colloquially known as the collector from the British Raj days, we have a colonial hangover. If you used to go to their office, it was like you have come to a survey server. There is crowds all around this guy who was just an IITian 5 years ago. He may be 29 or 30 years old. And he is like the local god. And he has 100 schemes to implement. Even if he wants, he cannot help but prioritize. It's not his fault. And if he occasionally becomes arrogant, that also is not necessarily his fault, because there is no other way he can take care of that place. Now, कहने को आपके पास block development officer है, आपके पास जिला परिषद है. But what happens is there is no local taxation in India. We made a mistake of having zero agricultural taxation, zero local taxation. All the money comes from the top. And the reality is, wherever the money comes from, the power comes from. So the collector is much more powerful than the block development officer or the Zilla Parishad guy, who might be theoretically elected. But ultimately, he develops on this person because he gets the central government schemes. So how do you incentivize? How do you structure? And do you also have enough people at the higher echelons? I think that is an issue that we have not solved in India yet. But the trend is clear that we are having a more flexible bureaucracy. We are having a lateral entry. We are increasing numbers. At the same time, unlike the past, we are doing some compulsory retirement also, right? You need a carrot and a stick also. And earlier there was no stick and no carrot at all. Right now, there is not much of a carrot, but at least some stick is there. But I fully agree with you. There are many unfulfilled positions across the state and union bureaucracy. And we must, especially grade A and B jobs, they must be fulfilled. Some waste will be there. Some inefficiency will be there. But that is across all countries and across all political regions. We need more talented people, and that ultimately will pay for itself. even if it is not as efficient as maybe a private sector or multinational job all the time.
True, Harsh. So it's a very long discussion. UP is a long state, and we can discuss on so many things. The discussion can go on, but we are approaching the time limit, Harsh. But we will continue this discussion till the election results are announced. Everyone will be discussing how many seats they are getting, but me and Harsh will be discussing about the future of the Uttar Pradesh and what to do about it. So, Harsh, thanks a lot for your time, and thanks a lot for coming to the show.
Thank you, Abhinav, once again for having me. Thank you for the excellent discussion.
And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. I know I'm not very frequent in the videos now because of the more hectic and more than hectic, erratic schedule. But I promise that I'll keep getting excellent speakers like Harsh every few days. But thanks a lot once again, Harsh.
Thank you. Thank you.